Well, good evening, brethren, and welcome to the Friday night Bible study for this first day of the first month. How about that? This is the first day of a brand new year on God's holy sacred calendar, and it's now starting the countdown from the first day of the first month to the 14th day of this first month. And after sunset on the 14th, when the day was the 13th and the sun goes down and it becomes the 14th, shortly after sundown, after sunset, when the 14th has begun, will be the first feast day of the year. That will be the Passover foot washing memorial. And, all right, we got our live signal going. I was just checking to make sure we got it. James Woodison, greetings to you out there. I see you're online with us. Great. And listen, I just ran in the door. I was out doing some last-minute shopping for just to have some stuff for the Sabbath, some special snacks and things. Because when I do the Bible study and do this Sabbath service in the morning, I'm often innervated. So I got some chocolate-covered coconut, and some things, and while I was in the store shopping, I left my lights on my vehicle. Have you ever done that? And your battery, was already on the margin anyway, kind of would start the engine, but as long as you haven't left the lights on while you're in the store shopping, you come back out and and so thankfully I was able to find some. I not long ago purchased some brand new jumper cables, have them in that vehicle, thankfully. And I was able to eventually flag someone down who was willing to help me jump start my car. I hope you had a good week. It's been a busy week for me, and I am very glad to see the Sabbath come tonight. Now, there are a few things I promised during the week on World Watch that I would cover on the Friday night Bible study, so I'm going to be sure we do that tonight. But let's just go back to the date where we are. By cross-reference, it's April 5, 2019 on the pagan Roman calendar. A calendar that will no longer exist. Hallelujah, praise God. Once Jesus Christ returns, that calendar, along with all the governments of men, boom, will be a thing of the past. Maybe a thing we'll only use for a historical reference, but we will not be using this pagan Roman calendar with January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December months on it, or weekdays that are named by pagan gods. The god of the sun, Baal, Sunday; the god of the moon, Moon Day, Monday; Tuesday, what god that is. Some of you know and remember. We studied that in college, but I don't care to worship those gods. Wednesday, the god of Thor for Thursday; the god of Fry for Friday, or Friar, and then they've renamed the Sabbath after Saturn, Saturn's Day, Saturday. Which is they worship the Saturn as a god, but it's really the seventh day of the week. God calls the Sabbath a day that He made holy to be a day of worship and reverencing of our Creator, remembering our Creator on that day, and setting aside all our servile type of work that we would do either for man or for ourselves. So it's a wonderful day of rest and edification, to review the things of God so that they stay fresh in our mind, and that even the Sabbath, we stop and do this to remember our Creator, and not only Him as the Creator at the beginning of the era of man, when He formed man from the dust of the earth, and then cleaned up this earth that had already been here for millions or billions of years, that he had created long before, when the angels shouted for joy. You know, they had already been created. But then when he created the physical universe, the angels shouted for joy over it. God made it so beautiful. If you need to see that, if you're new and tuning in, because I invited you from World Watch to tune in with us on Sabbath services on Facebook Live or Sabbath.tv, for some of the things I said I would cover, you can look to Job 38, verse 7, if you want to see the time when the angels shouted for joy. I think I've got that verse correct. I'm going to take a quick look in my Bible and cross-check myself here. Job 38, and it'll start in a few verses before that to give you the context, but verse 7 is the one that's going to say, when the morning stars, in other words, the angels of God, sang together, and all the sons of God, another reference for the angels, shouted for joy. Now, what were they shouting for joy over? Well, if you back up a few verses in Job 38, you will see, well, starting right at the beginning of the chapter, verse 1, God says to Job, Then the eternal Lord God answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, for I will demand of you, and you answer me. God said to Job. And then here it goes. God's going to grill Job. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if you have understanding. Verse 5, Who hath laid the measures thereof of the earth? If you know, God said to Job. Or who has stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof of the earth? Now, Job had laid the cornerstone with some of those magnificent pyramids. But Job well knew the earth, a much more complicated, colossal creation, building, as you could put it. And so God's grilling him with terms Job would understand, because Job was a great builder of physical things on the earth. And then God goes on to the verse we read already. Where were you when I did all these things involving the earth and creating and forming and shaping it? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God, all the angels shouted for joy. So there's a verse to go to for those who think, those creationists, who have it half right. But half right's enough to really mess up things, especially when it comes to trying to counter the evolutionists who look to scientists who say the earth has been here a long time, folk. And creationists say, no, God created it the way it is 6,000 years ago. Bzzz, wrong answer. Go to Job 38, verse 7. When God created it, the angels shouted for joy. That's certainly not an earth created in the condition it's found in verse 2 of Genesis 1. All right, those are for people that may be tuning in who are brand new, that watch our World Watch program, and understand we do not believe or teach that the earth was created 6,000 years ago. Man was created 6,000 years ago from the dust of the earth, from the dust of the earth that had already been here a long time. Of course, God had to remake it dust because Satan's rebellion had put water all around the earth. All right, now, I want to go back to the dates, though, because I want us to keep it very clear in mind that Thursday night, not this week, but Thursday night of the following week, Passover is right upon us. On the pagan Roman calendar, that'll be the evening of April the 18th. Now, know your calendars, the Hebrew calendar, the Jewish calendars, some of your church-related calendars. One I produce even, we quoted as Passover being on April 19, but we got an asterisk right there that says all feasts begin at sunset the evening before the date shown. So the date to be keeping in mind, as it comes up on you, is April 18, a week from this coming Thursday. That evening after sunset will be the Passover foot washing memorial service. Now, tomorrow morning I'll plan to play a video that Robert Collins, who was the initial host of Sabbath services on Sabbath.tv, made. We recorded it when he was giving the instructions for how to have your room set up for Passover. For those of you who will be doing it at home, whether you tune in with us here or whether you, as the head of household, conduct that service yourself, which you have the option to do, or you can tune in here with us on cogtv.org, on Sabbath services, Sabbath.tv, and we'll be streaming Mr. Armstrong giving the last Passover he ever gave. I'm thinking about also on another channel doing a live service myself, and then you have two options here for live streaming, or you can, as I just mentioned, you can conduct it yourself. Just have the scriptures you need and run through the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections. The first section is going to be the introduction for the Passover foot washing portion of it. Then the second portion of Passover evening will be the taking of the eating of the bread. The third portion of the Passover will be the drinking of the blood of Christ, the wine, the symbol for Christ's blood. The fourth section will be just kind of going through portions of the Bible like John 13, rehearsing the Passover and what it means. And the fifth section will be the ending hymn, where everybody sings a hymn together, and the evening is the most solemn evening of the whole year, the most solemn feast day of the whole year is then concluded with a hymn. And I'll just mention quickly what you'll need, and then I'll play the video tomorrow with Mr. Collins, Robert Collins, 50-year minister from Alabama. At age 77, when he did this, he gave rehearsed with you what you'll need to have in your room. You'll need to have a wash basin for the foot washing service. You'll need to have some warm water poured up shortly before the service commences, because after a certain amount of time, warm water will turn cold. So you want to have it a little warmer than you want it for the service, so that as it cools down a little, then it's at the point where we get to the foot washing ceremony, it's right there at a nice, comfortable, warm room type temperature, maybe a little bit warmer than room temperature, but comfortable, and a couple of cups for each person. And then for the breaking of the bread portion of it, you want to have some unleavened bread, not yet broken. You want the full cracker sheets out on some nice serviceware on a nice plate, covered with an immaculate white napkin. And then you break the bread when that portion of the service is done. There's a pause for breaking the bread, then everybody takes a little piece and eats the bread representing the body of Christ. And then for the drinking of the wine, the drinking of Christ's blood in symbol, you want to have already poured out about a tablespoon of red wine, plain red wine, not your sugary, super sweet wines, or wine in the alcohol range of approximately between 10 and 13%. You get any higher than that, and they're starting to get sugary, sticky, sweet. And, this is not a time for dessert wine. It's just a good, plain red table wine will be fine. And there are a lot of varieties of that. You could get a Cabernet Sauvignon. You could get a Zinfandel. Some of them are even labeled, just red table wine. I named a couple of examples. There are a lot of other examples of red table wines, but just a simple red table wine, and it's prayed over before service and represents the blood of Christ. And I already poured out in the smallest little glasses you've got. You can find a lot of places the little shot glasses, even if you have to get the plastic ones, you can pick up for $1 for an entire package of 20 little glasses at places like Family Dollar. For $1, you can get 20 of those little glasses. They hold a tablespoon fine and have little space to go. Have those on a plate, a white napkin over that, covering them, and then make sure your room is nice and clean and orderly, and you're good to go. You're ready to go for the Passover foot washing memorial service. All right, I'll play Mr. Collins going through that. He does it with illustration on video, and it's helpful so you don't forget anything. One of the most important things between now and Passover physically to be doing to make ready for it so you don't get caught short on the unleavened bread is to be watching on your grocery shelves for a package of unleavened bread crackers, the matzo type crackers. And you want to go ahead and buy them as soon as you can find them out there between now and Passover, because look, we're only 2 weeks, 14 days away from the Passover. Well, I guess you'd call it 13 days away, since this is the first already, and it's a Sabbath. You can't go out and buy them today. So you got 12 or 13 days before Passover to be finding your matzo crackers, your unleavened bread. And if you wait till just a day or two before Passover, where your local grocer may have had a nice supply on his shelf as you walk by between now and Passover, but a day or two before Passover, whoosh, all those matzahs just suddenly disappear. Because, the Jewish people use the matzos, the unleavened bread crackers, for their Passover. And they'll buy them up shortly before Passover, and people coming in at the last minute, and that stuff gets bought up. And then you got to drive all over the place, all over town, wasting time hoping you're going to find a box somewhere, or else you're going to have to go home and make some, create some that you make yourself. It's a lot better if you can just buy a box of matzos, unleavened bread crackers, and pick them up off the shelf. All right, that's just a word to the wise. I've gotten caught before from past experience where I waited till a day or two before Passover to go out and try to get my matzah crackers, and I remember seeing them in this store or that store, and I drive to both places and then talk to the manager. Oh yeah, they sold out, yesterday, day before, 3 days ago, when all the Jewish people came in and grabbed them up, Jewish people and some of us too. So good idea, just word to the wise, be looking for your matzo crackers. Now, you can always go find a bottle of red table wine somewhere. That's not a big problem. Most of you probably have some of that on hand, or you should, in case you get a cut or a bruise or something that, it's good to drink. The apostle, which one was it? Paul said, for your stomach's sake, drink a little wine, often. So it's good to even have some on hand. 2 or 3 glasses a day with a meal is actually good for a person. It's better than not having any. But then if you go beyond that, then it gets bad for you. But that's usually not a problem finding your bottle of wine. And like I said, it's also not only good for your stomach, but in case you get a cut, who was it? Dean Blackwell, in one of the Bible continuing education classes, he told us how his wife cut her hand one day when she was preparing food. She accidentally chopped her hand while she was chopping some onions or something, and cut a slash in her hand and was bleeding. And Mr. Blackwell said, "Oh, well, honey, I'll grab my keys. We'll head for the emergency room of the hospital." And a man, even a minister, can learn some things from his wife, some good things. Mrs. Blackwell said to her husband, Dean Blackwell, she said, "No, honey, just while she's holding her hand, she said, honey, just get me grab the bottle of wine there and the bottle of olive oil over here." And so her husband did what she said, and he's watching her, and she pours the wine in her hand, rubs it, Then she says, okay, the olive oil, and he poured it in there for her and rubbed it. And she kept doing that, mixing, pouring the red wine and the olive oil. Now, the red wine was, as Mr. Blackwell explained it, was it's got the alcohol. It acts as a sanitizes the wound where, any germs, you got the cut. It quickly helps prevent any infection from developing. And then the olive oil, and he said, my wife got this from the Bible, where God talks about the wine and the olive oil. The olive oil acts as an emollient that softens up the skin. And so after she cleaned it, put the olive oil on it, put a Band-Aid on it to hold the skin together, he said in a few days, he said her hand healed and you couldn't even tell. And he said it was a good, it was a good cut. By good cut, I mean, deep, not minor. It was a major cut. He said if we'd gone to the emergency center, they would have sewed it up and put stitches in there. And you would have seen, as many of you have seen people that have been sewed up with stitches, there's a scar that's left. You can see the scar line and the stitch, the places where they ran the stitches. You can see the stitches through the scar line. It leaves a scar like that with the cut and the stitches, the stitch holes. And he said there would have been a scar on my wife's hand. He said she kept putting the wine and olive oil on for the next days and rubbing it in. He said you couldn't even tell, and he had seen the cut. He said it was a major cut. He said you couldn't even tell anything had happened. And so I learned something from that. I keep at least a little bit of red wine in a bottle somewhere in the house where I know where it is, so I can grab it in the event of a cut. When I had a roofer doing some roofing work for me, he dropped nails all over the place off the roof. I had a designated place for him. He ignored that entirely. Nails were all around the house, and as I am watching his work and walking through around some of that stuff, 2 or 3 times, actually I hate to tell you, it was 4 times, a nail came through my shoe and poked into my foot. Well, I ran in the house, grabbed, took my shoe off, pulled the nail out, and poured some wine on there and rubbed it, and then rubbed some olive oil in there, and everything healed up fine. I didn't have to go get any, what do they call it after you step on a nail? Some possible infection. A lot of people go get a certain shot for it. Some of you know what I'm talking about. I can't think of the word at the moment. But having learned about the wine and olive oil trick, not trick, but God made that good stuff. I did that for the nail punctures I had in my feet, and I my feet are fine. So, all right. I don't want to give my enemies any ammunition. If I were to say, and I'm fine, some of my enemies would be saying, no, you're not. Hey, and friends, listen, when we keep this way, we do have enemies. Some of you have been communicating with me. I know you've been suffering from some enemies troubling you. When we keep the laws of God and the instructions of Jesus Christ, we are going to have people hate us. And Christ said that himself. He said, if they hated me, they'll hate you worse for following me. And I'm paraphrasing that. I should probably try to find that and put it up on the screen in a moment. But let me see if this is working. Let me come in here close with Mr. Armstrong, and I can switch the screen where he's appearing to a screen that's not working. Oh, thank you very much. I've got the Bible scriptures. Okay, I was wanting to put some of those up on the screen. All right, well, there we go. I can do it this way. Here's a verse that I often mention during the World Watch program. And the reason we're doing the World Watch program is primarily because of this verse right here, Luke 21:36, where Christ instructed, after explaining the 4 seals of Revelation in plain language, and more than the 4 seals. He was explaining the 7 seals from the book of Revelation. in plain language. And then he says here in this verse, I found where the shot is. I can come on screen with you with that verse. They said, let's see, what happened? We lost our closed captions. All right. For those that need the closed captions, I'm going to have to not be on this screen very long. But after explaining the seals in plain language, Christ said, watch and pray always so that you can be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass. Now, since the first 4 of the 7 seals are the only ones that are active now, he's talking about the 5th seal through the 7th seal, which gives you the timeline for events up till the return of Christ. So we're in the timeline of the first 4 seals. And Christ told us to watch those and pray without ceasing. Pray with all your heart, soul, might, and mind about them. And those who obey our future husband with this instruction, he holds out a carrot and says, so that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and so that you may be able to stand, be accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection for those called to the spring harvest. So this is important. This watching and praying affects not only your opportunity to be granted accounted worthy to escape the great tribulation, the 5th seal, and the 7th seal, year-long day of the Lord. You'll be through all of that. You'll be in a place of nourishment, protection, safety, and some good weekly Sabbath final training and annual holy day training too. You're not accounted worthy to escape. You try to keep the weekly or annual holy days. It's curtain time for you. The beast will follow the lead of the false prophet who will announce you anathema to Christ. Of course, he doesn't really have the authority from Christ, but he's allowed to be here like the devil, the god of this world, and he'll call you a Judaizer, and he'll call you anathema to the Catholic Church. And when he does that, the beast, in cooperation with that false prophet that rides and controls the beast, the new, revived Roman government of the revived holy Roman Empire will put you to death. But you don't have to worry about that. If you've been accounted worthy to escape, you're in a place, the only place the Bible mentions as being protected from the beast during the Great Tribulation. That's described, that place, and God describes it. He doesn't leave us. God says, Amos 3 verse 7, that, I tell you what though, let me come back over to this screen so that for those that need the closed captions, hello Mr. Armstrong, we got the closed captions up there. Amos 3 verse 7, I'm going to back up just a moment though. I greatly respect Mr. Armstrong, but I feel a little subconscious with him looking this direction at me as I do that. Even though, he continues to, as if it were, speak from the grave because of the way God has preserved his writings, his publications, and his speaking from broadcast, the radio and television broadcast, and from Bible studies and sermons. And as you know, here we often, as much as I can, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit though, Mr. Armstrong, if you don't mind. As much as I can, we play recordings of Mr. Armstrong's speakings so that we stay close during this time of scattering to the direct words of God's end-time apostle, whose apostleship has not been replaced. And this deserves emphasizing. Even though God had Mr. Armstrong be involved in appointing a new pastor general over the church, which is the body of Christ, he did not give, and it was, as Mr. Armstrong himself said to the man he helped position as the new pastor general, he said, and the men asked for it. He said, well, make me an apostle too. You're giving me that too. No, and Mr. Armstrong said, I that's not mine to give. Mr. Tkach, you'll have to earn that, and show God that you've earned it. Then he will give that to you. Well, he wanted it now. He even prematurely claimed that he was the new apostle, and in one way he was correct about that. But unfortunately, he made himself a false apostle by his prematureness in claiming apostleship that God hadn't given him and that he had not earned. I'm talking about the new pastor general after Mr. Armstrong, Joseph Tkach Sr. Wonderful, fine man. And if he were never called, yet if it was just one of those fluke things where, Satan puts snares in, and some of the snares, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong word, tares. Satan puts tares in among us. Some of those tares are outstanding, wonderful people. They, in certain respects, put a lot of us to shame with their zeal and boldness for doing good. But one thing that God's apostle explained to us that is good to understand, there is good on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Men come up with some things that are good. They recognize the parts of God's law that are good, such as you don't kill your fellow man, or you don't murder him. There are homicide penalties for that. You don't steal his stuff. Thievery. Man can recognize stealing from your neighbor. Well, that's bad, and so he creates penalties for that. And so that part's good, that he recognizes the good parts of God's laws in that way. The man used to uphold adultery. Anymore, they just look the other way on that. People live together, not only men and women, but men and men and women, and now the governments of man have even sanctioned marriages between same-sex people, which now that is not good. That's something as not only not good, God calls it a perversion that he speaks very strongly against. So you see how man deciding for himself what's right and wrong, when he picks the things that God says are wrong, he does good, like not stealing, not committing murder. When he used to say, don't commit adultery, don't have sex with another man's wife, or don't be having sex if you're not married. When they used to uphold that one, that was good, but they've let go of that one. Lying, committing perjury, they consider that's wrong, so they recognize that's good, but then a lot of people lie anyway, and they kind of sometimes overlook that. Lusting, even the Apostle Paul said, I wouldn't have even known what lust is, except God explained that, because man doesn't recognize lusting, thinking, I want my neighbor's things, I want my neighbor's wife. That's lust, coveting, and a man usually doesn't make laws against that. You've got to actually go do the wrong. And insulting one's parents, not honoring the parents, well, man doesn't have too much recognition of that. Maybe a little bit where parents used to be held accountable for their kids. Well, actually, in some cases, parents are still held accountable for their kids' wrongs, may even have to pay penalties because of a wrong the kid does. But then the governments of man today often tie the hands of parents against punishing their kids that would have helped keep them from doing some of the wrong things that then the parents become accountable for, or have to pay the penalties for, in terms of when there's things damaged and have to be paid for. And then the commandments that refer to God, to man's relationship with God, they totally disregard, not only disregard the fourth, they go the other way. They pick a day that's the day of worshiping Baal and call that your blue sky laws, they call that, the day that man should worship God. Sunday, the day of the sun god Baal. All right, now, what was I doing? I was going to, all right, I mentioned Daniel 11:41 describes the only place in the Bible that mentions an area that is outside the reach of the beast during the Great Tribulation. In other words, the only place on the earth that's recorded in the Bible as being protected from the beast during the Great Tribulation. The place that, if you do what Christ said do in that verse, let's go back to it for a moment. In that verse that, let's see if I can find the button again now. Here. Luke 21:36, it says, if you'll do these two prerequisites, you can be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, beginning with the fifth seal, Great Tribulation. Now, some of you might have noticed that I kind of left out reading the word therefore. It's kind of thrown in an odd place here in the verse, where Christ was saying, watch you therefore. Therefore refers back to some condition, or statement that was being made before this, before being told to watch. There was a reason to watch. It's in the previous verse. Let's back up to verse 35, where here Christ says, after he's explained the fifth seal of Great Tribulation, he says, it comes as a snare on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. That's a long, poetic, beautiful kind of a way, expression of saying, as the French would say it simply, tout le monde, everybody in the world. This fifth seal, Great Tribulation, pops up on them. That beast ascends out of the bottomless pit so suddenly, it catches the world off guard. It catches all them that dwell on the face of the earth, of the whole earth, like a snare, like being caught in a snare, like a mouse being caught, boom, in a mousetrap. Yeah, and listen to that thing scream as that mousetrap lid goes down on it. He wasn't expecting that when he ran in there to try to get that cheese or peanut butter or whatever bait was put on the mousetrap off there. And men, they go after the bait of sin and lust, and they're going to be caught just like a little mouse in a mousetrap, like an animal in a snare, a trap in the woods. Caught off guard when this beast ascends out of the bottomless pit. And because of that, that's why Christ said in the next verse, therefore, watch you and pray always. Pray without ceasing. Pray with all your heart, soul, might, and mind. These things you watch. Pray for the people affected by the first seal, white horse, false religion, with Christ having said, many will come in my name, saying that I am the Christ, and yet, how did he say that exactly? And yet shall deceive many. Hang on, let's go to Matthew 24, where Christ says that, and let's see. Am I in the right? Oh, I'm in the wrong chapter. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm in 21, like Luke. I need to be in chapter 24 of Matthew. Okay, in the very early part here, he says, verse 4, take heed that no man deceive you. He's explaining that first seal, white horse, in plain language here. And then verse 5, here's the core of it right here. For a few shall come in my name, saying that I am Christ, and shall deceive a few people. Oh, wait a minute, Stephen, that's not what that verse says. I got my Bible open. Well, yeah, you're right. It says, for many shall come in my name, saying I am Christ. They'll say that Jesus is the Christ, and shall deceive many? Yeah, that's what it says right here. Many. And shall deceive many. And that relates, of course, to Revelation 12, verse 9, where Christ describing that old serpent, that great dragon, as the devil and Satan, who deceives a few people here and there. No, it says, and deceives the whole world. And, of course, then that relates to Matthew 24, verse 5. shall deceive many. Then that second seal, depicted in Revelation by a red horse, Christ describes here in verses 6 and 7 of Matthew 24, you shall hear of wars and rumors of war. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet, for there must be world war. Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And that only began to happen in last century, in 1914 to 1918, with the first round of World War. Now, I mentioned on World Watch the other night I would cover a few things related to the League of Nations and the United Nations, two organizations that were formed, one after the other, to prevent war. There was after round one of World War that ended in 1918, ran from 1914 1918, the League of Nations was created. The United States had some involvement in the background, but basically refused to be one of the permanent members of it. The permanent major members of the League of Nations, as they formulated it in 1919 to become effective in January of 1920, were France, the United Kingdom, and Italy and Japan. Interestingly, Italy and Japan, part of the enemies of round two of World War, were half of the main parties for the creation of the League of Nations, which had initially some 42 members and then was passed by over 100 and something countries to operate to prevent another world war. But when Japan was criticized, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations. Japan was criticized by the League of Nations for its campaigns into China, its warring, going in and invading China. So when the League of Nations criticized Japan, Japan simply removed themselves from the League of Nations. And we found out in the long haul of it. Now, Russia was able, it wasn't initially a member, it was able to become a member later. Let's see, what happened in 1926? But one thing that became obvious, the League of Nations, they didn't have power to enforce their recommendations and suggestions to countries like criticizing Japan. They didn't have the power to stop Japan from invading China. And as mentioned, when they criticized Japan, Japan simply withdrew from the League of Nations. And so it was ineffective at preventing war and world war. It was created right after. They started formulating it in 1919, right after round one of World War ended in 1918. And then 1935, as Mussolini invaded Ethiopia and then revived the old Holy Roman Empire, as he announced himself the new Julius Caesar in 1935, the new Il Duce, and he himself said, I have revived the Holy Roman Empire. And God's end-time apostle saw that, heard those words, and was inspired by God to announce it on his radio programs, coast to coast and as far around the world as his radio broadcast initially would go, and then later when Radio Luxembourg opened up, he's announcing to the whole world how Mussolini became the sixth king of Revelation 17, verse 10. We'll cover the rest of the seals in a moment. This is one of the things I had promised on World Watch I would do on this Friday night Bible study. And so I'm trying to be careful to keep my word, so we may not have Mr. Armstrong talk tonight. But the things I'm telling you are involve him very much. He was in attendance during the formation of the United Nations as they were piecing the Constitution for it together in 1945. He was in San Francisco, staying in a hotel and covering the daily events of the formation of the United Nations in 1945. And he was doing that as a reporter for the Plain Truth magazine and as a reporter for the radio broadcast The World Tomorrow. And I wanted to be able to pop up on the screen Revelation 17, both verses 8 and 10. If you want to get your Bibles ready and go there with me, I'm going to see if from this long distance, from this device that's got the Bible program on it, I can punch up. I'll tell you what, let me go ahead and get the screen ready. We'll go back to this screen. In fact, we're even going to go ahead and go back to this screen because what I want to do is I need to walk over here and I'll just tell you loudly what I'm doing. I'm punching up Revelation 17. And then once we get to chapter 17, we'll go, first of all, we'll go to verse 10. All right, I've almost got it. I can get that on screen, and then I can come back over here with you. Okay, this, friends, is a very important verse. It explains there are 7 kings. Now, these 7 kings are not concurrent. They are consecutive, one after another, beginning with, let's see, I've got their pictures right over here on this other screen. As soon as I see the guy's picture, I'll be able to think of his name. Justinian. There we go. I got it. Beginning with Justinian in 554 A.D., when Justinian restored the imperial form of government to the Roman Empire. Now, what is an imperial form of government? That's where you have a dictator-style government, and maybe you even have someone who appoints that dictator. And in this explicit situation with Justinian, he was appointed by the then current Pope of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church, in 554 A.D. He began this long session of kings that became the first 5 kings that ruled in 5 continuous dynasties from Justinian through Napoleon from 554 A.D. to 1814 A.D. Now, can you write down those numbers and do the math? Put 1814 at the top. That's when Napoleon lost the campaign of 1813 that Prussia, Germany, had initiated against France. Now, we see all today in the news of late, since January this year, when German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron got together in Germany and signed a formal writing about a new Franco-German alliance. They actually made some of the EU leaders upset and angry over that, saying, you two, you're not the only countries involved in this EU combine of the EU 27. I'm excluding the UK, which is supposedly someday, either soon or as now being talked about a year from now, another year of having to cover the daily dose of Brexit on World Watch. That has been keeping me up very late at night because that, you know, a lot of stories, friends, when I research the news and I say, all right, this story is worth covering, there'll only be 2 or 3 versions of that story that I read through, and I'll pick one, maybe use them all. And it is not a big deal. But when you talk about Brexit, especially if there's some little rumble that given day, there won't be 2 or 3 stories. There'll be 20, 30, 40, 50 stories on that same subject. And you start pouring through that, and of course, what Mr. Armstrong taught Gene Hogberg to do, which he taught the people who worked in the news bureau to do, is the way to confirm and validate a story. One of the things taught was to check all the sources you can find that report on it. And especially when you get a report from over here and a report from over there, different reporters involved, you get different points of view. You know, there's a movie, I think, what's it called? It's about car accidents where 5 different witnesses have 5 different things they saw about the accident. And that's one reason why God had 4 writers, 4 apostles, write the Gospels about Jesus Christ, so that you would get the vantage point of Matthew, the vantage point of Luke, the vantage point of Mark, the vantage point of John. And our first year Bible in Ambassador College, we used a textbook called Harmony of the Gospels. And what it did was it laid out in 4 columns, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, side by side. And when an event in Matthew was the reference on the left side for everything else. When Matthew would be discussing or describing, reporting on, writing about a certain event, then Matthew, Mark, then right next to it, it would go to the chapter and verse where Mark is covering that same event. And then in the 3rd column, Matthew, Mark, Luke, it would go to where the chapter and verse where Luke would be covering that same event harmoniously, harmony of the Gospels. And then, of course, the last column with John would be the chapter and verse with John covering that same event. Now, in some cases, all 4 didn't cover every event, but in many cases, all 4 would cover a given event. And what you would see is that one would give so much of what happened in the event, and then you look on the other and you say, oh, hey, here's an added little detail that in Luke that Matthew didn't cover, or in Mark that Matthew and Luke didn't cover. An example, Mark 13:8 is the only one that mentions the word tarake in respect of the 4th seal, attaching to the 4th seal not only disease epidemics and seismic conditions and activity, to the 4th seal, the pale horse, with a rider on that horse named Death. We're going to come back in a moment. I'll cover all 4 seals. I covered the first 2. Now I'm jumping over to the 4th seal, the pale horse with the rider on it named Death, alongside whom rides Hades, hell, the grave. And that primarily being described by Jesus Christ as the activity of loimus, meaning disease epidemics, pestilence, the plagues of Egypt. But Christ also said that during the timing of that 4th seal, an element, you peg it right there on the 4th seal, is seismic activity, commotions in the air, gale force winds of all kinds, commotions on the ground, with the examples being given in the Greek-English lexicons that detail what the word seismus that Christ used means, as meaning earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, wildfires, floods. Did I mention volcanic eruptions? I think I did. Any kind of seismic activity on the earth, whether it's spewing ashes up into the air from a volcano or twirling the air around in gale forces such as hurricanes, typhoons, tornadoes, etc., or just shaking the earth like an earthquake, seismically rattling the earth and swaying buildings and knocking some of them over and opening up holes in the ground and people and cars and buildings falling into the holes. Or you know, in the volcanic eruptions, they cover both commotions in the air, spewing all that ash in the air, and they also cause lava, hot, melted, boiling, melted lava, fiery lava, oozing down the sides of mountains and across landscape, and in some cases creating whole new entire islands. All that is seismic, seismos, as Christ, excuse me, friends, as Christ explained it as part of the fourth seal. And the major thing, though, is the loimas. The secondary thing would be seismos. The third thing that only Mark mentions in Mark 13, verse 8, is terake, however you would pronounce that Greek word, that means trouble, mob seditions, roiling waters, general trouble. For these fine definitions, you go to a good Greek English lexicon. Go beyond. Strong's is good. I'm not criticizing Strong's Greek English lexicon or their Hebrew English lexicon and the Strong's Concordance, back of a Strong's Concordance. But if you want more and finer detail and much more work done and given, and only to lexicon work, not also being a concordance, go to a good Greek English lexicon and you'll see more detail. And so, terake, only used by Mark. You won't find that in the harmony of the Gospels in either Matthew, Luke, or John. It was only used by Mark. And so you got four, but the point I'm making here is you got four witnesses. By the way, that word Mark used in chapter 13, verse 8, terake, roiling waters, mob, seditions, trouble, is just general trouble, the beginning of sorrows that leads up to the fifth seal, mega trouble, as Christ worded it. The King James renders that beautifully as great tribulation, mega trouble, great tribulation, coining a term that's kind of unique in a way that when you hear those words, great tribulation, it should trigger, for most of us, the fifth seal of the seven seals of Revelation, the worst time of trouble that's going to be coming on the face of this earth since the beginning of the world in this time. This is how Christ described that. All right, I'm getting away from where we want to talk about, but let me do that quickly. Matthew 24, verse 21, I think it is, that Christ describes the time of trouble coming in the Great Tribulation as the worst time of trouble since the beginning of the world. Let me get the exact words if you want to go there with me. I'm going to Matthew 24, verse 21, where Christ says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time coming just ahead of us, sooner than later, in the near future. No, nor ever shall be. Nothing before it, nothing ever shall be. Nothing in the future ever after shall be as bad as what is coming in this fifth seal, Great Tribulation." And that's why you should want to Luke 21:36 it, to be accounted worthy to escape it. And if you're not accounted worthy to escape it, guess what? The latter part of that verse 36 will come. I'm going to put that back up on the screen in a moment. The latter part of that verse 36 of Luke 21 applies to you as well, where it says you're not accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man. The criteria for being accounted worthy to escape is the same criteria for being accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man in the Great Tribulation. Well, somebody say, well, wait a minute, we can't earn that. That's a gift. Yeah, but we can disqualify for it, and one of the qualifying factors, two qualifying factors actually, are the prerequisites given by the two prerequisites given by Christ in verse 36 of Luke 21. I know some of you say, Stephen, I hear you talk about that all the time. It's almost like you harp about that. Well, yeah, you're right. And one of the things, we'll come back in a moment to this scripture on the screen, but I'll put Mr. Armstrong back up on the screen. As I mentioned to you, he would, for a long time, covering the two trees, he was covering that Sabbath after Sabbath after Sabbath after Sabbath. We'd get there and somebody say, oh, wonder what Mr. Armstrong's going to talk about today. Somebody else would say, well, same thing he talked about last week and the last 2 or 3 months. He's going to talk about the 2 trees again today. Want to bet? I'll bet you dinner. Anybody take the person up, on the bet for the dinner, they're going to have to pay for the dinner, because sure enough, Mr. Armstrong would be talking about the 2 trees again. And as he would explain with a little joke, he would talk about some Protestant minister that kept giving the same sermon every week, and people in his audience came up to him and said, "Preacher, you realize you've given that same exact sermon for the last 3 months?" And the preacher said, "Yeah, and I'm going to keep giving it to you until y'all start doing so you start doing it." You hear it, you don't do it. Mr. Armstrong gave that as a joke and would say, "Yeah, I'm going to keep talking about these 2 trees, brethren, until you understand it." And of course, he'd add little elements to it each time, but he'd still be basically saying the same thing. Well, Mr. Armstrong, sir, when I harp about Luke 21:36, which Mr. Armstrong endorsed, he encouraged us, brethren, to be observing the words of Christ in this verse, 36 of Luke 21, to be, I'm sorry, I don't have that up on the screen yet. Let me come back to Mr. Armstrong. I'll put Luke 21:36 back up there in a minute. To be watching and praying always. Those are the 2 prerequisites for both being accounted worthy to escape and being worthy to stand before the Son of Man. I should pop Revelation 12, verse 17 on the screen, because I've mentioned before, some of you have heard me talk about the sermon that a deacon gave in some Sabbath meeting somewhere that somebody sent me a recording of, and it was actually a sermonette, so it wasn't a whole long sermon. It was very short. And I listened. I thought, okay, a long-time friend of mine sent it to me and went, "Hey, listen to this guy." Blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay, to accommodate my friend, I had a little time, which I rarely do anymore. I'm sorry, some of you are you're sending me things. My email just temporarily got shut off. You're probably getting messages saying, mailbox full. I'll clean that up pretty soon. Some of you, though, that are sending me, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, and I listen, I love you as I say this, so please don't feel like, oh man, the guy's mad at me. No, I'm not mad at you. I would appreciate, though, if you understand, when you send me 25, 30, and 40 emails a day, and let's say I'm busy because of repairs I'm trying to make to get a reverse mortgage inspection that keeps being delayed because I keep delaying the work that I'm trying to do, or I keep embellishing the work, or I'm trying to do it right and correct and get a ceiling leveled, a new ceiling I'm putting in where when the roof was leaking did a lot of damage. And so I keep putting off the inspection man coming, and they tell me, "You're going to have to sign all the papers all over again." Well, that's fine. I'll sign them. But before that inspector comes, I don't want him downgrading my appraisal, because when he sees all this repair that still needs to be done. So at some point I'll get to it and I'll say, let him look at it anyway. We'll put contingency statements in there. Y'all fund me and we'll hold the money back and I'll fix it. But I might not get to my email for a couple or 3 days. And then if you're sending me 25, 30, and 40 a day, by the time I get back to it, not only do I have 200 to look at from you, which is sort of like, where am I going to find the time for that? I wish you'd summarize. Just some of that stuff is actually good, but instead of separate emails, summarize it. Put it all in one email. Just send me one email a day if you're going to do that. And then I get other junk email. And when you go public, people grab your email address and they send you all these offers and stuff like that. And I have to tell it, don't send me that stuff anymore. Anyway, it's easy to get overwhelmed with your daily stuff. And so what was I trying to say? Well, I was trying to say, I'm thankful for the Sabbath. Yeah, all right, I need to get my thoughts refocused, because I actually have people who are enemies who watch me and they love it when I goof up. They'll take a recording of where I goof up. They pick the times when I've had the hardest week, when I'm tired, And, and sometimes when you're tired, you may goof up your words and, slur them and not speak coherently at a given moment because you were up till 5 o'clock a.m. Let me see. How late was I up? This is Friday night. I got to bed by, what time? 2 o'clock last night. The night before that, though, it was after 5 a.m. in the morning before I got to bed. Now, I got 7 hours sleep that morning. See, that would have been Wednesday night going into midnight Thursday. So by Thursday, I got up around a little after noon because I got 7 hours of sleep from sometime after 5 a.m. till a little after noon. All right, but the point is, sometimes you'll push yourself and not be as coherent or alert or whatever, and your enemies are watching you and say, oh boy, I got him now. I'm going to put this on my website and show how creepy this guy is. There's a guy out there named Dennis the Dill Pickle who really, he hates the truth. He went through Ambassador College, worked as a minister for over 20 years, and he hates now the truth that God taught us through Mr. Armstrong. He really loves to tear Mr. Armstrong apart, and anyone who holds fast to the truth God gave us through his end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong, why, to the Dill Pickle, you are a creep, and worse than a creep. You're like a big slush of mud, and he'll watch you from time to time, just looking for a moment when it sounds like you've slipped up, goofed up, or not coming across very well, and he'll tell his audience, look at this creepy guy now. And maybe he doesn't realize he's actually brought me some audience, because even in the comments in his own blog, where he's compared me to some other speaker, and usually he compares me against people who've started church groups that have blankety-blank Church of God, banana peeling, vanity plate type names to it to make it sound like their organization is a church that you can join and should be a regular attender of. He loves to compare me with some of those people, and some of the people that watched the videos he links to of me and then the other people, he said, well, hey, the guy you're talking against, calling creepy, he's better than this other guy you referenced over here. And I even though the people that read his blog usually are people that hate Mr. Armstrong or lean that way or something, I actually was happy one day when I saw somebody saying, well, he's better than that guy you compared him against. He's saying he's the more creepy. He's talking about me. And somebody took up for me and said, no, he's better than that guy that you compared him to. I watched that video, and they're watching something he pulled off when I first started after Mr. Collins died. And I didn't even want to be on this side of the camera. I liked it over there on that side where you are, the back of the camera, pointing at the speaker. And I enjoyed that when Mr. Collins was alive very much. And I didn't, after Mr. Collins died, we were off for 6 months, even though I had committed to keeping things going. And as I was praying, saying, Father, who else should I ask now? I've asked this minister, that minister, old friends from college who went out in the ministry. Would they like to take this seat so I, can be a two-man operation, at least a two-man operation, with me continuing to run the cameras and helping do the research and running the audio and the video switcher and everything else. And everybody's saying no, they don't want to do it. And then while I was praying, God said, you take it, Stephen. And I said, well, I committed to keeping things going. I'll take it on and the prayer was take it on an interim basis. And I said, okay, I'll take it on an interim basis, but, you find somebody else for this as soon as you can. And, of course, so I sat down in front of the thing, and I was like, yeah, of course, you take some of those recordings, which unfortunately we had on Amazon, and so people could download them. And sure enough, this guy does that, and he slaps it on his blog and says, look how creepy this guy is. Well, yeah, when I first started, I was uncomfortable with looking at a one-tube monster. Now I'm a little bit accustomed to it. But I just point that out. Mr. Armstrong, you know you had enemies, sir, and people who stand up for you are going to have enemies. He stood up for Christ. Christ told us. I wanted to find that verse. Christ told us, if they hated me, they'll hate you. I wanted to find that for some of you that are telling me about people that are persecuting you because of your keeping this way. And they are. Now, we're going to come back where I was, but let me get some help real quick. There's 2 or 3 ways I could do it. This voice way is a nice, neat, fast way. I think, oh, wait a minute. This one may tell me it's not synced. Yeah, this one's not going to let me do it that way. There is a verse. Some of you know right where it is. I tell you what I can do. I can pop it up over here. If they hated me, they're going to hate you. I like using that electronic thing because it'll change words for you around. If they hated me or persecuted me, they'll persecute you. Let me see if I can get a verse to pop up. If the world hates you, John 15, verse 18. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. John 15, verse 18. So, I hope that's some encouragement to some of you that have been telling me people have been slamming you and slandering you and all that. I get that too. Mr. Armstrong got that. Christ got that. And he said if they hated, and they strung him up in a crucifixion after he had to take a horrible beating for us, by which stripes we are healed, and we should be counting on that. John Byron, I hope you're doing better. All right, now I realize I got a little sidetracked, and we only have a few minutes left to go. Bible study is 90-minute time. We're into it by an hour and 13 minutes. So let me try to bring this to the focus of where we were going. All right, Mr. Armstrong, let me come back to this verse on the screen about the 7 kings. So let me short focus on this. There are 7 kings, 5 are fallen. This is important for us to understand, friends, because this helps us realize where we are in this very end time prophecy that's got a future element in it that is part of what we are or should be wanting to watch for, to see when this 7th king ascends out of that abyss, out of that bottomless pit, as it's called in verse 8 of Revelation 17. But let's get the foundation. There are 7 kings that Christ had the Apostle John write in this prophecy about. And they are the 7 kings, beginning with the 5 that are fallen from Justinian through Napoleon. There was Justinian beginning when he restored the imperial form of government, the dictator form of government, with the Vatican, the Pope, the Catholic Church involved, setting up emperors of the Holy Roman Empire and crowning them, holding the coronation ceremonies and crowning these first 5 of the 7 kings, beginning with Justinian, 554, followed by Charlemagne. I've got that picture. That would be good. Let me come back here and put the double screen up, and we're going to advance to the picture of the 5 that are fallen. On this screen that's behind me here, I'm punching the button. I'll turn around to it in a moment. Yeah, right here. Okay, let's come up close to these. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you see a portrait of Justinian. Then next to him on the top row in the middle, you see a painting, a portrait of Charlemagne being crowned by a pope. You see the man there in the red cape, the red robe, putting a crown on the head of Charlemagne. That's supposed to picture a pope putting the crown on the head of Charlemagne as the second dynasty of kings, of 7 kings, and more specifically of the 5 of those 7 kings that are fallen, as Revelation 17 verse 10 is describing the first section of those, or the second section. The first section saying there are 7 kings, then it says 5 are fallen, so now we're in the second section describing the 5 that are fallen. The second one is in the middle, top row, Charlemagne. Then come over to the right side on the top row, right up here, we've got Otto the Great. So starting out with Justinian, Charlemagne, Otto the Great. Then we go to the second row on the far left side, you've got Charles V. He was the 4th of the 7, he was the 4th of the 5 kings that are fallen. And yes, he's the 4th of the total of 7 kings, but getting specific to the section 2, the 5 that are fallen, there's one more. Right in the middle of this second row, there is Napoleon, the infamous Napoleon with that crazy hat that represents him so well. He is the 5th and last of those 5 that are fallen of the 7 kings. Their dynasties ran from Justinian, restoring the imperial form of government, the dictator-style form of government, with the Pope involved, crowning each one of these 5 kings that are fallen. From 554, beginning with Justinian, through the conquest, the campaign of 1813 that ended in the spring of 1814, that Napoleon lost to the Prussians. The Prussians are your most Nazi-like Germans. They are the harshest, the fiercest, the fighter people. And Prussia is still a province of Germany today. Only not so much known or recognized by that name. A lot of people get confused and think, oh, Prussia, that sounds like Russia with a P in front of it. No, it's not Russia. Prussia are your Germans, the most vicious of your Germans. And they initiated the campaign of 1813 against Napoleon that caused Napoleon to lose the Holy Roman Empire into the abyss after a 1260-year continuous reign. That's a prophetic number. We'll have to just go into that another time. We got 12 minutes left for me to finish the focus where we are. And this is important before Passover, because I'm going to make a tie-in to Passover as I conclude this tonight, friends. It is important for you to have in your mind during Passover and right now. I'll explain that before we sign off. Well, let me make a mention of it now. It's important because this understanding tells you where we are in prophecy very explicitly, very expressly, right now. And God tells us in the Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, he says, know the status of your flock, know the state of your affairs. And your affair is a spiritual affair. You've got a relationship. If you've been called to the spring harvest, you have, you and I have a relationship with the Father who called us to Christ. And we can't come to Christ except the Father call us. John 6:44 and John 6:65. And for those who have been called to the spring harvest, you don't have a fall harvest fallback option. You do have a Laodicean era fallback option. I'll explain that in a moment, but that's where you get left behind. I made reference to Revelation 12, verse 17. We've got to cover that before I end. I was mentioning this sermonette that a friend sent me that references that sermon the friend sent me, the deacon speaking, references those who are left behind after Philadelphia are taken to a place of safety. He mentions the Laodicean era, saying about them, they obviously, the reason they got left behind, he says, and become the Laodicean era is because they were not keeping the commandments of God. Buzz, bzz, wrong. Order, wrong. You know, because there's a verse of Scripture. Why would I say the sermonette giver is speaking wrong? Because he's speaking unbiblically. You know, and when there's something in the Bible that says this is the way a certain thing is, and you stand up behind a lectern on a pulpit and say the opposite of that, you're speaking contrary to God's Word, the Bible. Now, if it's not in the Bible, that's and you say this or that, that's different. But when the Bible says clearly a certain thing and you stand up and say the opposite of that, man, you don't know your Bible. I alerted the man that sent me the sermon that I said, hey, you probably want to let this guy know, since you attend where he is and you're used to getting on to the people that make mistakes, to let him know, look, he spoke contrary to the Bible. Now, I think my friend may be upset with me that I told him that. I don't know. I hadn't heard back from him. I wrote him a second time and said, hey, have you let the guy know? The Bible says just the opposite of what this guy said. The Bible says in Revelation 12, verse 17, where do we need to come back to? All right, I was in Matthew 24, going through the 4 seals. Let me quickly cover the 3rd seal, and we can close off this section, and then I can try to wrap it up in the next 5, 6, 7 minutes. The 3rd seal in Revelation is pictured by a black horse that Jesus Christ describes. Which screen do I have? Let me see something here for a second. All right, I want to leave these guys that picture the 7 kings, the 5 that are fallen, plus the one that has now also fallen, because his time of is-ship, present tense being the one that is, has come and gone between 1935 and 1945, Mussolini. So I want to come back to this, as we mentioned, the 7th seal that we're watching for. We don't know who that is yet, but that crown of the Holy Roman Empire in the middle of this bottom row pictures the one we're watching for to come. All right, so I've covered why we need that slide, so I can come back out for a moment, and we can back these up to where I've got the chart that shows the 7 seals, and here's the first 6 of these 7 seals. That 3rd seal is depicted in Revelation by a black horse, which Jesus Christ described in plain language, real short, sweet, and simple, as limus, the Greek word limus, meaning scarcity of food, or in short, in other words, famine. All right, so those are your 4 seals that Christ told us to watch. Now, all right, so we covered Matthew 24. That verse in that man's sermonette, where he was saying, the Laodiceans must not have been keeping God's commands. That's what he said. But look what God says in Revelation 12, the last verse of Revelation 12, verse 17. God has the Apostle John, from the Isle of Patmos, 90 AD, say to us, in verse 17, and the dragon was wroth with the woman after those accounted worthy to escape are protected by God. The devil had sent an army in verse 15, after the portion of the woman accounted worthy to escape. God caused the earth to open up in verse 16 and swallow that army the devil sends after them. So now the devil is just super angry with the woman being a church in prophecy, and in Revelation 12 it's the true church, divided, let's not say divided, but apportioned into a portion that's accounted worthy to escape, and another portion that is God's church, that is keeping his commands, but they didn't follow the instruction of Jesus Christ in Luke 21:36. We Luke 4:4, Matthew 4:4, we live not by bread alone, but by every word of God. So we have to do what Christ, our future husband, said, in addition to what the Father said about the commands. You got to hearken to my voice, keep my commands, my statutes, my judgments, but you also have to follow the instruction Jesus Christ gave as he was here on this earth in the flesh in Luke 21:36, saying, therefore, because the 5th seal comes as a snare, therefore watch. the four seals that are active, and pray without ceasing, with all your heart, soul, might, and mind, about the people affected by those four seals, so that I can see the kind of heart in you that says, yea, I can account you worthy of my kingdom, and I can bonus you. I can account you worthy of escaping the fifth seal and the seventh seal, and all that's going to happen with the great tribulation of man and Satan, and the pouring out of God's wrath in the year-long day of the Lord's seventh seal. But here's the verse that tells that minister who was saying the Laodiceans must not have been keeping God's commandments. Yes, they were. Look at the verse. The dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant. Now the remnant a remnant is something that's left after the other main part is gone. And the main part was accounted worthy to escape. They went into the wilderness, flown on two wings of a great eagle, verse 14 of this chapter 12 of Revelation. And so the serpent, and as they're being, as those accounted worthy to escape are going into the place of protection, it's not easy street. The devil sends an army. We have to run. A few might get picked off if you're not in good health. If you're overweight, or whatever, you better run. You hear the expression, you better run like the devil. You better run like the devil's after you, even if you are counted worthy to escape, because the devil sent an army after you. But God is protecting us. He opens up the earth, swallows the army, and when the devil sees that, he is more angry than a wet hornet, to use another worldly expression. And then verse 17 says, and the dragon was wroth, super angry with the woman, the true church. He can't get to the portion that's accounted worthy to escape, so what does he do? He goes after those who were not accounted worthy to escape, that God calls here in verse 17, the remnant of her seed, who keep the commandments of God. Yes, that remnant, those left behind, were keeping the commandments of God. I wish you would tell that minister, or any minister you hear, standing up behind a lectern on a pulpit on a Sabbath service, telling people, oh, the Laodiceans must not have been keeping the commandments of God. Tell him to look at verse 17 of Revelation 12. Yes, they are and were keeping the commandments of God, but that is not enough. We have to obey our husband, who we are espoused to. When God says, what is the most important thing for us? This is the tie-in to Passover. Where we are right now, brethren, while we're scattering, we don't need to be trying to repeat the work that God has done through his end-time apostle, because of God having preserved what he did through that apostle in writings and recordings. And they're more available now on the internet, a new open door. An additional open door that no man can shut until the Great Tribulation begins, when the EU, bet your boots, they're going to close down the internet. They're already curtailing it. We've had news stories showing how they're cutting it here, cutting it there, causing Facebook even to be concerned about what the EU is doing now with their little clamping and creating of laws and you know. And there will come a time when the fifth seal opens up, when what God has preserved and made more available on the internet is going to be shut down. That'll be the 1335. And his word won't be available anymore. But that is when the two witnesses will come on the scene, which may be a revived, what's the word when somebody who was dead, a resurrected Herbert Armstrong and his son. Possibly. I'm just saying, Jeff in UK, Bricket Wood graduate, might be right that God's going to resurrect the two of the Armstrongs, or Mr. Armstrong and somebody else, as the two witnesses. We don't know that yet, but that's an option God has. He's certainly capable of doing that. We'd love to see you again, Mr. Armstrong. You bet your boots. And we will, regardless. That, or when Christ returns, we're going to see Mr. Armstrong, and he is for certain going to be, as one of the apostles, he'll be over the spring harvest of the Philadelphia era. And if you're not with that, and probably the Laodicean era too, that were with us, but They failed to keep the instruction in Luke 21:36, and so they weren't accounted worthy of either at that moment of standing before the Son of Man in the first resurrection, nor of being accounted worthy to escape this great tribulation coming. And so, what happens to those that are in this category of Revelation 12, verse 17, remnant being left behind? What happens to them? The devil's wroth with them. How can they make it into the kingdom now if they weren't accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man, or the bonus of being accounted worthy to escape the great tribulation? That great tribulation is the way they get in the kingdom if they're willing to endure martyrdom. Revelation 3, verse 18. I don't have time to read it. I can just give you the reference. Look at it. The central verse that addresses the Laodiceans talks about an era of martyrdom, and that's the way you can buy your way in the kingdom of God if you found yourself in the Laodicean era who blew it because you didn't keep Christ's instruction in Luke 21:36. Friends, it doesn't get any plainer than that. Now, why is that important to us? I got to finish. I'm 2 minutes over time, so let me wrap this. How does that relate to where we are with Passover? Passover begins, actually this day, this first day of the new year, today being the first day of the first month on God's holy sacred calendar. This is truly the first day of spring, right now today, with God. I know man does it his peculiar way, and he already started spring a few weeks ago on different governments. It's not the same around the world. The governments tell you when spring is for that government, for the land where you are. God says it's today. And on the 14th, we're 2 weeks into the new year, into the spring, and Christ instructed us in Matthew 24 related to this great tribulation that's coming, and he said, therefore, watch and pray always. But he also said just before that, Matthew 24 and about verse 20, he said, pray that your flight. You see, it's essential. If you're doing the right thing, if you're watching and praying, you get this bonus. You get this bonus flight that's mentioned in Revelation 12:14 as being a flight on two wings of a great eagle. Revelation written in symbol, meaning symbolically, most likely, a modern jet aircraft. Hopefully Boeing gets their 737 all straightened out. They'd probably send us off on a bunch of those Boeing 737 MAX aircraft that had a problem with nose-dipping software that pilots had to know how to switch off to keep when it gets an inaccurate reading, to keep the plane from nosediving so much it crashes. It was designed to prevent a stall, but it does the equivalent of a stall. Instead of stalling with the nose too high and whoop, slipping down, it nosedives down. Just the same effect though. The plane crashes. But symbolically, Revelation 12:14, two wings of a great eagle, probably means jet aircraft for the most part. With some exception, God has the ability to do it literally if he wants to, and fly some on the eagle or chariot of fire. It's all symbol. But Christ related to that in Matthew 24 and verse 20 says, pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. And that's why this ties to Passover, where Passover's in the springtime. Christ was saying, pray your flight be not in the winter, not in the fall or the winter, not in the cold time, because frostbite, being outside, this flight's going to involve being outside and fleeing from the devil's army outside. And if this is in the cold, some people may freeze to death. Some of you, I promised I'd show you my ducks tonight. I'm sorry. I found one of my ducks dead in the pool. The other one, who might have gotten out of the pool, I had little things for them to be able to get up on, but I don't know, they were still little duckies. I got to build me a nice, protective duck thing. I was real sad this morning, go out and find one of my ducks dead and the other one's missing. The new little ducks I just got a couple of days ago. But I'll fix them a nice protective duck house, and we'll start over again at the right time. I really need to focus on getting the house in order anyway, and I found out that ducks were going to require a lot of my attention, so it may be a blessing from God that he took that burden off of me. I would have been spending time today trying to build a duck shelter. So when I found them dead, I said, well, forget that. I barely got things done today as it was. But here's the point about where we are with Passover being in the spring and Christ saying, pray your flight be not in the winter. Things are such with these four seals. John Byron knows it. Become friends with John Byron on Facebook. And thankfully, John has improved since I had to put out a prayer request that he was really weak, having trouble breathing. He went to ER one day last week. Brethren, those of you who pray for John Byron, thank you. I'm on his behalf. I want to thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. John is a lot of encouragement to me to keep up the nightly Sunday through Thursday night World Watch program, knowing John is always there, and he comments to me. Keeps me going. Sometimes when I'm so tired, I say, oh, God, will you forgive me? I just don't want to do the work tonight. I don't want to, I'm too tired to do this program. People like John who keep me encouraged, I bite through it. I bite the bullet. I go ahead even while I'm exhausted and do the program. And afterward, I say, God, thank you I did that. I feel better. Thank you for giving me some energy, and thank you for helping me stay on top of it, and those who utilize the program to help them stay on top so they have a reference point for then simply praying, which is, I say simply, but it takes a lot of effort. John can tell you, those of you who are doing it, and myself can tell you, you watch it, and then you got to do the second part of it, do the prayers without ceasing, with all your heart, soul, might, and mind. That takes effort, but that's what qualifies us, keeps us from being disqualified. It causes God to account us worthy, even though we don't really deserve it. It's a bonus in both cases, like you won't believe, to be able to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection. Only a few are called now. And only those in the spring harvest marry Jesus Christ. What a position we get to be the bride. Everybody else, fall harvest, comes in as children, as kids. They don't marry Jesus Christ. That is reserved for the spring harvest. That's one of the things that makes the calling to the spring harvest so outstandingly, very special. So, brother, I hope you're motivated and encouraged by that, and to avoid being disqualified from standing before the Son of Man in the first resurrection, and to avoid having to get in there the hard way of having to buy of God gold tried in the fiery trial of martyrdom because you were left behind, and God says, that's the only way in now, folks. Those of you left behind that become the Laodicean era, I counsel you to buy of me gold tried in the fire, the fiery trial of martyrdom. Revelation 3, verse 18. But he says, endure that to the end. Don't cave in on this. Don't become lukewarm. Don't ignore me. And you will be at the marriage supper with me. And because you die in martyrdom, you, 1 Thessalonians 4, 16, 17, 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 55, you come up first in a moment, in the twinkling of the eye, when Christ returns. You rise first, while those who remain alive on the earth stand there and watch all of y'all come out of the grave. Of course, I'd rather y'all have that honor who are left behind as the remnant and who endure, as Christ says do, as he comes, knocks on your door. Then we have to seek him now. Those telling you Christ is knocking on your door, so come and join our group, they're just trying to corral you into their little flock, you know. Christ isn't knocking now. We have to seek him now. But he does come and knock on the door of those left behind, just as God the Father had to send angels to comfort Christ the night before his crucifixion. Christ says, I know what you're going through. I will come to those of you who wind up in that position and you're all emotionally upset, as I was, full of anxiety the night before your crucifixion, before they're going to burn you at the stake or cut your head off on a guillotine or tear you apart, whatever they do to kill you. But that's how you will buy the gold to enter the kingdom, if you were left short and lukewarm because you weren't following Christ's instruction now to watch and pray always about these first four seals that are active now, so that you can escape that fifth seal, the next major event and prophecy to come. Friends, I am 10, 11 minutes over time. So excuse me if I covered what I wanted to cover with you. I hope you got the tie-in to Passover. We're in the spring. If you've been praying, if God has said, look, these seals, they're so blossoming now that, like I said in the comparison to Christ, saying, when you see the limbs of a fig tree or any tree become tender and the little buds on the limbs begin to blossom, you know that summer is nigh. Likewise, when you see these things bloom and blossom, these first four seals that are active, blooming, increased with frequency, increased with impact, then know that the kingdom of God is near, meaning know that that fifth seal, starting a 3.5-year countdown clock, is about to spring with the beast ascending, spring open with the beast ascending from the abyss. That German Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, on January 30 told everybody to take the time to look into the abyss. She knows what's in that abyss. She knows that beast, that old Holy Roman Empire, is down there. She knows the potential of what Germany's leading the EU into may well be a revival, with co-president, council president of the EU, Donald Tusk, saying, the Pope, our Pope, he calls the leader of the Catholic Church of the Vatican our Pope, the Pope of the EU. And sure enough, he is going to be the one who crowns, if history repeats itself, he'll be the one who goes to Frankfurt, Germany, up to the second floor of the Romer building, where the Kaiser's Hall, the Emperor's Hall, is located. He'll go up there and conduct that ceremony just like they've done in the past. You saw the portrait of a painting of a pope putting the crown on the head of Charlemagne. That's exactly what will be repeated in history for the seventh and final king of Revelation 17. I didn't get to verse 8. If you look at verse 8 of Revelation 17, let's see. Well, do we have that handy real quick? Hang on, I can pop that back so quick that we can just do this. We're already over time. Look, go back 2 verses. This is verse 10 of Revelation 17. If we back up 2 verses to verse 8, it talks about the beast that you saw was and is not and shall ascend. It was from 554 AD to 1814 AD, through the 1260-year continuous reign of the 5 that are fallen, Justinian through Napoleon. And then after that, it is not. It went into the abyss, it's called the bottomless pit in the King James Version. That's the way King James renders the Greek word abyss, the abyss. The Holy Roman Empire went into the abyss, or the bottomless pit, between 1814 and 1935. When Mussolini revived it out of the pit. It ascended out of the pit for 10 years, 9.5 years, from the fall of 1935 to the spring of 1945, under the one is of this verse 10. Let's go back to it. You see the 7 kings, 5 are fallen. One is, the one is was Mussolini from 1935 to 1945, with Hitler holding his hand as a subservient of Mussolini. And the other is not yet come. That's the 7th king. And when that 7th king comes, he must continue a short space. He is going to come by ascending out of that bottomless pit that's mentioned here, the abyss that's mentioned here in verse 8 of Revelation 17. And the beast you saw it was from 554 to 1814, and is not. It was not from, what years did I say? From 1814 to 1935. It was not. But then it ascended out of the bottomless pit, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit in 1935, went back into the abyss, the bottomless pit, in 1945, and now it's in that position German Chancellor Angela Merkel was talking about. Take the time to look into the abyss. You're going to see a sleeping beast in there. You're going to see that old Holy Roman Empire in that abyss, that bottomless pit, being made ready and waiting to shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into the worst form of perdition, perniciousness, pernicious ways and evil that you've ever seen. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder because of the perdition, the perniciousness of this beast that's coming as the seventh king. They that dwell on the earth shall wonder whose names were not written in the book of life. Those of you watching here, hopefully your names are written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, those called to the spring harvest, when they behold the beast that was from 554 to 1814, was from 1935 to 1945, and in between those times is not now, and yet is, because he's not dead. He's just sleeping in that bottomless pit, in that abyss, waiting to ascend one last time as the seventh king of, let's see, what happened? How come as the seventh king of these seven kings mentioned in Revelation 17, verse 10. Brethren, do you get it? That's just ahead of us. The biggest thing Christ wants us to be doing right now, besides putting sin out of our lives, because that would disqualify us if we continue with unrepented of sin, which includes even the small stuff, defiling the body like smoking. Some of you have got some big overcoming to do. And you need to start making headway against it. But whatever it is, you got to put all sin out of your life. Any unrepented of sin will disqualify you, get you left behind. And then, as a blessing, maybe you can buy your way out of it with gold tried in the fire, the fiery trial of martyrdom, and that you'll endure then. But far better is to follow Christ's words in Luke 21:36. Am I able to get that back up on the screen before we close up? Let me see if I can punch a button that'll bring it back. It got, all right. But you've seen it. I've had it up there. Luke 21:36. Watch and pray always, because this thing comes like a snare on everybody in the world. So don't get caught off guard. Be watching, be praying, so that you may be accounted worthy of two wonderful things: to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection, and prior to that, as a bonus, be accounted worthy to escape the next major event in prophecy, that fifth seal, great tribulation, that we have pictured up here as the fifth of the seven seals of Revelation. Brethren, I went way over time by a good 20 minutes. I hope that's okay with those of you on a Friday night. We did reasonably start close to on time tonight, so we're not too terribly late. I'm going to wish you a happy Sabbath. Hope you get a good night's sleep. We'll be back again in the morning. It's still Sabbath. It's Friday night on men's calendar, but it's already Sabbath evening. In the morning, it'll be Sabbath morning. It'll still be the first day of a brand new year, the first day of the first month, as we do the AM service to the U.S., PM to the U.K. It's 9:30 a.m. Central Time. That works out to be 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, 2:30 in the afternoon in the U.K., Greenwich Mean Time, or what's the way they reference that now, but in London and all of England. So, God willing, get yourself a good night of sleep, a little prayer, be ready for some more study in the morning for the AM to the U.S., PM to the U.K. Sabbath service beginning at 9:30 a.m. Central Time. That'd be it's early on the East Coast. 8:30 a.m. You can watch it later from the archive, or you can watch it from bed. It's a nice time on the West Coast, 10:30 a.m. on the West Coast of the United States, Pacific Time, and 2:30 in the afternoon in the U.K., Italia. Wonderful fellow from Italy who is living in the UK, who tunes in with us. I got to have you tell me more about your church background, Italia. I'm very interested to know. Hope all of you are looking forward. Be making your plans now. We are less than, well, where are we? We're exactly 2 weeks away from the night to be much observed. That'll be 2 weeks from tonight's Bible study time. Friday, that'll be a Friday night April 19, the night to be much observed. Be making your plans for that now, whatever you're going to do with a family or however you're going to get together. Be good if you're working on your plans for that now. Brethren, I took us way over time. Let me sign off. Look forward to those of you that are going to join us again in the morning here on Sabbath.tv from cogtv.org and the Sabbath service channel of Facebook Live. All right, brethren, I'll get our going out of here on the screen, and I'll say Shabbat Shalom. God willing, see you tomorrow morning here on COGTV, Sabbath.tv, and the Sabbath service page of Facebook Live.